The difficulty of ancient Rome, and seeing it and understanding it today, is that there still is a modern living city that you experience. You don't get a sense of a bustling city with over 1 million people. You have that lost because there are so many other Romes built on top of it. So we have to come to a place like Ostia Antica.
What you see here is basically a really good snapshot of how Roman life was in antiquity, especially at the height of the empire, as well as how the city looked around its decline in the 5th and 6th centuries. Unlike Rome, you don't have to look too far to find ancient Ostia. It's right here around us.
The history of Ostia starts a very long time ago. It goes all the way back to the regal period. So from a very early time, Rome is interested in the mouth of the Tiber River. It's their access to the Mediterranean. It's also access to the salt pans. And salt is one of the earliest commodities of ancient Rome and ancient societies. They start off their foundation not as a city, but as a military fortification. And this is called the castrum. And the incredible thing about the layers of history in Ostia Antica is so much of the outline of that castrum has been preserved. Many of the walls of the original fortification have been incorporated into later structures.
In the Republican period, Ostia is not so impressive. It's still competing, let's say, against other prominent ports, but ultimately, by the end of the Republic in the 1st century BC, Ostia is beginning to rise, and the Emperor Augustus and his right-hand man Agrippa start to build it up.
Ostia quickly develops into a town, and this town has many of the main components of any Roman city. There are temples, there are gathering places, there are going to be warehouses because they're always going to be interested in storing the goods that are being brought to Rome. And when things are brought to Rome, they always stop in Ostia and they are checked. They are cataloged, they are numbered and stored.
So it's the place where grain comes in for the city of Rome, where olive oil and wine, precious materials, marble, gold, all these things are brought in to the city of Rome through Ostia. So it's a big, bustling port, but at the same time also a sleepy seaside town for the wealthy who live out there.
Ostia is critical. If Ostia is well, it means that Rome will do well because the grain is coming through Ostia to get to feed upwards of 750,000 to 1 million people. Ostia means the security of Rome.
In the imperial period, Ostia radically changed. It gets built up in a series of campaigns, primarily under Trajan and Hadrian. And this is when you get Ostia appearing as a magnificent city in brick. And as a ruin, it's really impressive, but all that brick was covered with fresco, was covered with marble, was covered with stucco. And the public buildings were more frequently sheathed in marble because they are representative of the government of Ostia, which is tied to the government of Rome. And this is when Ostia was the cosmopolitan city. This is when you had at least 16 Mithraea. So people are worshiping a god all the way from Persia. This is when you have the synagogue. This is when you have the church meetings, the clandestine church meetings of the early Christians. All of it's taking place here in Ostia. It's a reflection of what Rome looked like in the imperial period at its height. Ironically, when you get to the high point of Ostia, it's immediately followed by the decline of the city. And the reason that's happening is that very successful man-made harbor of Claudius and Trajan are so successful, people start to bypass Ostia, and Ostia starts to decline.
Portus has taken everything. Everyone's going through there. They now have a canal that cuts directly to the Tiber. There's no need to come to Ostia for anything anymore.
So because of its own success in terms of being the nozzle into which the flow of material from the Mediterranean world feeds into Rome, Ostia is deemed not suited for all of its traffic, not big enough.
So the port that's built to try to help it out eventually ends up taking over. It's like if you have a mom and pop, grocery store and everyone's going there all the time, and they're like, oh, it's so packed, well, we'll just build another one down the street. and that's bigger and better, then everyone starts going to the bigger, better one, the little one goes out of business.
Ostia is still, however, inhabited. There are people who still like to live there, and a class of wealthy citizens, probably people who work at Portus, in fact, or have business interests in Portus, use Ostia as basically a resort town now.
Ostia becomes a little more relaxed, a little less busy. It's still filled with bath complexes. There's still lots of activity, but it's much less than it was in its heyday.
It becomes a very residential city at this point. The trade has dropped off quite a bit, and a lot of these public buildings that were used for storage and such have kind of fallen out of disuse, so then these houses can kind of move in and take over.
By the 4th century, the end of the 4th century, Ostia is a Christian city. There's an impressive Constantinian basilical church within the walls. There's a lot of activity of dismantling and taking apart the pagan structures.
Ostia basically goes out of use. By the early 5th century AD, there was a very tiny population left, and most of the population switches to Portus, which is even more Christianized.
What happens to Ostia is it gets covered over by sand dunes. It gets covered over by the debris from the collapsed structures. And in the papal period, because some of the monuments are still large enough to poke through the debris, they are explored, they are investigated. But true excavations only happen under Mussolini in the 20s and 30s. And modern excavations have only been taking place in the past 50 years.
Even though Ostia has been abandoned now for over 1,000 years, it has come back to being the doorway into ancient Rome, as it was even 2,000 years ago. So through Ostia, we can actually see and understand what life was like in ancient Rome in a way that's not possible working in the city of Rome itself. So Ostia is still, even today, fulfilling its function of bringing people and ideas into the city of Rome, but in this case, it is ideas about how the ancient world worked through scholarship.